All the Young Jews by MsKingBean89, Chapter 15, First Year, Aftermath. Most of the Gryffindors hung around in the common room, gossiping and chattering, all wondering who could have done it. The Marauders, usually keen to be up at the centre of any debate, all crept upstairs, pale-faced with guilt. Remus sat on his bed, staring at the floor. He'd gone too far. He knew that. It had felt good for a little while, and nothing couldn't convince him that Severus hadn't deserved it. Now James was looking at him oddly, and he knew that Dumbledore would find out somehow. Lily didn't tell everyone as soon as she came back to the common room. "What happened?" James asked, carefully. "Did you lose control of it? That was really strong magic." "It was amazing," Sirius said suddenly. "He'll think twice about crossing us again." "But, we didn't want to hurt him, did we?" James frowned. "He's fine. He was just pretending to get us in trouble." "Will we get in trouble?" Peter asked, wringing his hands. "Didn't all do it, did we? It was only—" Sirius slapped him around the back of his head. "You rat," he said. "We're all Marauders, all for one and one for all." "Whatever that means," Peter muttered, rubbing his head, going to sit on his own bed sulkily. "I did it. You lot shouldn't get in trouble," Remus said, quietly, not looking up. "It was half my idea. I did the research. Don't worry, Lupin. I bet you anything he's fine." "If he is," Remus said, heavily, "it's no thanks to me." Finally met James's eyes. They were deep brown and much more serious than usual. "I did mean to hurt him." James held his gaze and nodded slightly. There was a knock at the door, diffusing the tension. It was Frank Longbottom. "You thought to come to McGonagall's office now," he said gravely. They followed Frank down the stairs and through the common room, where everyone stared at them. Remus looked at his feet the whole time, but he heard through the chatter go quiet as they walked through. It didn't really matter what happened next. Everyone would know they were responsible. McGonagall was not alone. Dumbledore stood beside a desk, his arms folded in front of him. He smiled pleasantly at the four boys who stood in line before him. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. "Good evening, Headmaster," they all chanted back. "You may be interested to know that young Mr. Snape is quite well, though his pride has been rather wounded." They all said nothing. Remus didn't look up. "He seemed to think that you thought something to do with his misfortune," Dumbledore continued, pleasantly, as if he was just passing the time of day. "Particularly you, Mr. Potter." James looked up again, opened his mouth, then closed it again and looked down. Remus couldn't bear it. He only had 3 friends in all the world, and he wasn't going to lose them now. He stepped forward. It was me, sir. I did it. He said some stuff to me earlier, and I was pissed off with him. Wanted to teach him a lesson." He forced himself to look up into Dumbledore's pale blue eyes. The old man nodded, satisfied. "I see. You acted alone?" "Yes." Remus pulled out his wand. "Look, I could prove it." "No need," Dumbledore said hurriedly. "I believe you, Mr. Lupin." "It wasn't just him, sir," Sirius burst out. "I looked up the spell. I learnt how to do it too. It's just as much my fault." "You mean you planned this, Black?" McGonagall said sharply. "You planned an attack on another pupil? 10 points from Gryffindor, each." Sirius looked down again. "And detention for all of you, for a month. I find it very hard to believe that Mr. Lupin here acted alone." All 4 of them hung their heads. "You may go, gentlemen," Dumbledore said, quietly. "I have no doubt that you will all take the time to apologise to Mr. Snape, of course." Sirius made an indignant noise, and James elbowed him roughly. They turned to leave. "Mr. Lupin, just a moment." Remus froze. He should have known he wasn't going to get away with it that easy. He stood still as the others left the room, McGonagall following them out to make sure they didn't loiter outside. Once the door closed, a still silence fell. Dumbledore didn't speak immediately, and finally Remus raised his head to meet the headmaster's eyes. He didn't look angry or disappointed. It was usually a pleasant expression, tinged with curiosity, perhaps. "How have you been finding Hogwarts, Remus?" That wasn't a question he had anticipated. Okay, I suppose." "You seem to have no problem making friends." That wasn't a question at all, so he didn't answer it. He looked at his feet and then back again. "Am I getting expelled?" he asked. Dumbledore smiled. "No, Remus. No one is getting expelled. I can see that you're sorry for what you've done. The thing that concerns me is how you did it. That was a very strong spell. I wouldn't have expected it from a first year. You must have been very angry. Remus nodded. He didn't want to tell Dumbledore why, about the name Snape had called him, or how he made him feel stupid, worthless, and small. Passion is an important quality in a wizard, Remus, Dumbledore was saying. It directs our magic, strengthens it. But, as you learnt today, if we do not exercise control, then we endanger everyone around us. He looked very serious. His eyes had lost their twinkle. I do not wish to frighten you, Remus. When we first met, I told you that I sympathized with you. The hand you have been dealt is not one I would wish on anyone, but you must be more careful. You are a gifted wizard. Do not waste it. Remus nodded, wanting more than anything for the conversation to be over. He'd rather have the cane than a lecture. Worst part was that Dumbledore was right. He'd let his anger towards Severus influence the spell he'd used. He just wasn't used to having that kind of strength. I'm sorry, Professor, he said. Severus, is he okay? Yes, he's perfectly fine. I think he was hoping that if he simply stopped struggling, then whoever was casting the spell would stop. He's been dried off and won't suffer any long-term effects. Oh, Remus nodded. Good. Now, Dumbledore smiled, off you go. I've kept you long enough, and I have a feeling that Mr. Potter's waiting for you outside for you to tell him everything. Dumbledore had given him a lot to think about, and he had plenty of time to think. McGonagall was deadly serious about their detentions, and even went as far as to split the four of them up. Sirius was tasked with scrubbing the cauldrons in the dungeons, Peter with polishing the trophies in the awards room, and James with reconfiguring every astronomy telescope in the tower. Remus was given the worst task of all, locking out the owlery. Of course, none of them were permitted to use their wands, and every night they had to begin all over again. Cruel and unusual, what it is, Peter complained at the end of the first week as they fell into bed, filthy and exhausted. To know what you're moaning about, Sirius grumbled. I'd love to polish trophies. Who knows what I've caught scraping out crusty potions from the bottoms of those bloody cauldrons. James just groaned, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. Remus did not complain, because he didn't feel he deserved to. He felt terrible for getting all of his friends into trouble, but even more terrible for what he had done. This was only exasperated by the amount of reading he had been doing. Sirius's spell was difficult, less intuitive than the magic he was used to. Sirius was the first to admit that it wasn't perfect. It wore off after an hour or so it had to be repeated. Remus had just about mastered it enough to perform alone, though it also took him a few goes before he got it right. The very first thing he had done was visit the library and borrow a book from the magical creature shelves. Every night, after they'd done their homework and served their detentions, Remus would draw the curtains around his bed, light his wand, and read the same chapter over and over. There were entire books written on this particular problem, he'd found, but he was terrified that someone would become suspicious if he started checking them all out. Plus, he wasn't sure he wanted to know any more. The things he'd read so far were bad enough. He constantly thought about the book, in lessons, at mealtimes, during detention. Words like monstrous, deadly, and darkest of creatures flashed in his mind like neon signs. He'd known that he was dangerous, of course. He'd known that he was different. He hadn't known that he was hated. Wanted, even. Apparently, his teeth were worth thousands in certain parts of Eastern Europe. His pelt was worth even more. There were the legislative details, too. Things he didn't fully understand, but which sounded horrible. Employment laws and registries and travel restrictions. It seemed that even if he could read, that his job prospects might be no better in the wizarding world as they were in the Muggle world. He also understood why Dumbledore had told him to be careful. It was clear now that if anyone at Hogwarts found out what Remus was, then he might be in real trouble, and expulsion would be the least of his concerns. Frustratingly, nothing he read was really relevant to his experiences. There was no account of a wizard actually living with the condition, how they'd managed, what to expect, whether they had been able to hold down a job, or even just avoiding hurting others. He'd assumed that it was normal that he could smell blood and hear heartbeats, but how could he know for sure? Was it normal that his magic was stronger when the moon was rising? Sometimes he thought he could feel the sheer power of it, fizzing in his veins like a potion, filling up, spilling over, bursting from his fingertips. And then there was his temper. How much of that was him and how much of it was the monster? He lay awake most nights after the reading spell had worn off, and he was too tired to cast it again, but too restless to sleep. His mind whirred with worry and fear. How simple everything had seemed back at St. Edmund's. No magic, no homework, no agonizing moral dilemmas, and of course, no friends. If anything stopped Remus from just giving up, it was that. It was James, who had the ego the size of a lake, but a heart to match it. Peter, who, yes, granted was weird and a bit clueless, actually had a wicked sense of humour and could be unfailingly generous. And of course, Sirius. Sirius could keep secrets, at a main street, but never directed it at his friends, was the most gifted student in the year, but spent all of his time coming up with pranks instead. Remus wasn't going to give up any of that, not if he could help it. Even if he had to be the swottiest student in the school, if he had to force himself to read every book, complete every assignment, follow every rule, he'd be so good they wouldn't know it in him. So good that they'd have to make him a prefect. He'd do it all, if it meant staying at Hogwarts and keeping his friends. There was nobody to talk to about any of these things. Nobody would understand, anyway. As far as Remus knew, only Dumbledore, McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey knew about his condition. McGonagall was too severe to approach with questions like that. Remus still wasn't sure that Dumbledore wasn't completely sane. And anyway, he had no idea how to make an appointment with the headmaster, so it had to be Madame Pomfrey in the end. He waited till the next moon, which came at the end of January. It was a Sunday, so after dinner he separated himself from the marauders and headed up to the hospital wing, earlier than usual. "Remus," the nurse smiled at him, surprised. "Didn't expect you tonight, Paul." I want to ask you some stuff," he said, shyly, his eyes darting around the room. There were a few students lying in beds, most of them sleeping. Fortunately, Madame Pomfrey was very discreet. "Certainly. Shall we pop into my office?" It was much nicer than any of the teachers' offices Remus had been in so far. The walls were lined with hundreds of neat, orderly bottles of potions and tonics. It was light and airy. She didn't have a desk, and instead of wooden seats, there were comfortable armchairs seated on either side of a fireplace. "How could I help, dear?" she asked, settling in, gesturing that he sit down. "Well," he swallowed, not sure where to begin. I had a few questions about my problem." She smiled at him, kindly. "Of course you do, Remus. That's perfectly natural. Is there something specific you'd like to know?" "Yeah, I did a bit of reading. I know there isn't a cure or anything." "Not yet," she said, quickly. "Advancements are being made all the time." "Oh, okay. But for now, I suppose I just want to know more about it. I don't remember anything when I wake up. I just get really hungry." "You'd like to know more about the transformation?" "No, not just that. Stuff like, does it change who I am the rest of the time? Does it make me..." He looked down at his hands at a loss. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. There was a hard lump in his throat. "Remus," Madame Pomfrey said, "this is a condition you have. It isn't who you are." "I get angry sometimes," he said, staring into the fire rather than looking at her in the face. "I get really, really angry. Everyone has emotions. They're perfectly natural. We just learn to control them over time." He nodded, taking this in. He couldn't tell her the rest. "When I change, it's getting worse. Harder." "Yes," she replied, solemnly. "I did read that it can get worse at the onset of puberty." "Oh, okay," Remus nodded. There was a long pause. "How much worse?" I couldn't say. Really are the first of your kind I've treated." Another silence. Remus felt no better than he had before, no less confused. "Would you like to borrow the book I mentioned?" He nodded, finally bringing himself to look up at her. Madame Pomfrey's book, Fur to Fangs, Carrion for Magical Half-Humans, was moderately more helpful than some of the others Remus had read so far. There was a lot he still couldn't understand. Advanced healing magic and complicated potion recipes, more details on legislation, and even more terrifying, trials and persecution. Conversely, there was a lot that he already knew. He had been bitten and mustn't be allowed to bite anyone else during a full moon. Silver hurt him, and there was no cure. The book did indeed say that with the onset of puberty his transformations would increase in intensity, and that he would become more dangerous afterwards. It did not mention changes in abilities, magical or otherwise, and there was nothing solid referring to changes in mood or temper. He didn't consider it particularly interesting or important to know that he had a shorter snout than real wolves or that his tail tufts. He'd rather not think about having either. But he was curious to discover that he was only a threat to humans, particularly wizards. Apparently, other humans were in no danger from him. He amused himself, thinking that Mrs. Norris was safe at least. It did not go unnoticed that Remus had withdrawn from the Marauders since the attack on Snape. "Where have you been?" they'd ask, every evening as they all dressed up for bed. "Homework," he'd shrug, or sometimes, "detention," though he hadn't had another detention since the prank. The truth was, he was always as far away from other people as he could get. He deliberately tried to stay out of the room until it was time to sleep, and even avoided the common room if he could help it. He felt that until he could get control of his magic, he'd better not get involved in any more of James and Sirius's schemes. And they were scheming. He knew that for sure. Sometimes, at night, Remus could hear them sneaking into each other's beds, then whispering furtively before casting a silencing charm. Other times, they crept out with Peter under the cloak. They always tried to wake Remus, but he ignored them. During the day, he hid away at the back of the library, or else in one of his secret places. He found places all over the castle that were small enough to climb inside and go undiscovered for hours at a time. Windows that had been long bricked over, but retained high, broad ledges, small, empty chambers like priest holes, concealed behind the tapestries. The fifth-floor girls' bathroom. There, he could curl up and read for hours. Sometimes he actually did his homework, while other times he forced himself to research his condition. He had another reason to hide. Since the incident, Snape's hatred towards the Marauders had intensified, and he went everywhere with Mulciber, using him as a personal protection. If they crossed paths in the hallways, Remus always had to be ready with shield and charm. Mulciber knew more axes than Sirius and James combined. One afternoon, Remus was deep into a book on ancient battle magic. There was a chapter in it on the Withdrawal, Germanic wolf warriors who fought the Romans. He was sitting up high on his favourite window ledge and couldn't be seen from the floor unless somebody was really looking. He'd climbed up using a rope charm they'd learnt about a few weeks ago. He was just about to climb down and go to dinner when he made a wrong move and knocked the heavy book off the ledge. He winced as it plummeted to the hard stone floor with a deafening thud. "Who's there?" a voice came, further up the corridor. He heard footsteps, and with a sinking feeling, Remus realised he knew who it was. "It's just a book," Mulciber said, sounding sullen. "Yes, but where did it come from?" Snape replied, suspicious. Mulciber roughed. "The library?" Snape muttered under his breath, sounding exasperated. Remus pressed as hard as he could against the stone wall. "Who's up there?" Snape called in his nasal, spiteful voice. Silence. "Humenum revelio!" Remus felt an odd tugging sensation on his stomach, and before he knew it, he was being pulled off the ledge by an unseen force. He yelped, scrambling for something to hold onto, and ended up dangling from the edge by his fingertips. Snape and Mulciber laughed and blow. "Well, well," Snape purred, "if it isn't Loony Lupin. Where are your little friends, eh? Put you up there and forgotten about you?" "Piss off, Snape," Remus hissed, losing purchase on the stone, hoping he wouldn't break his ankles when he finally dropped. "Igniscopum," Snape smirked, pointing his wand. A thin rope of fire shot towards Remus, forcing him to kick off from the wall, landing on his back on the floor, hard. He blinked, winded, but quickly climbed onto his feet, withdrawing his own wand. "Okay," he said, his back sore from the floor. "You got me. Now go away." "Why on earth would we do that?" Severus replied, facing him off raising his wand. Expelliarmus! Snape roared, beating him to it. He clutched Remus's wand gleefully, then added, Gillesco. Remus felt his feet fuse with the ground, sticking him in place. He groaned. He was stuck now. It might be worth calling for help, but the corridor was a quiet one, and he didn't want to look like a coward. He stared at them both, defiantly, setting his jaw. Mulciber, Snape turned to his troll-like companion. Weren't we just saying the other day that we needed to practice a few more hexes? I feel like this might be a perfect opportunity. Mulciber grinned, licking his lips. He raised his own one, not quite as elegantly as Severus, but with the same malicious intent. Lapidosis! Nothing happened for a moment, and Remus felt a surge of relief, before suddenly, out of nowhere, a cloud of tiny stones, like gravel, appeared floating in midair. It hovered between Remus and Mulciber for a few moments before beginning to fly at Remus's face, like a swarm of angry bees. He immediately raised his arms to protect himself, but Severus was too quick. Incarcerus, he said, yawning, as if he was bored. Immediately, Remus found himself bound, tightly by rope, now hardly able to move at all. The stones kept pelting themselves at him, and all he could do was shut his eyes. He struggled, knowing it wouldn't help, but needing to do something. He didn't want to cry, even when he felt a hot trickle of blood slide down his temple. What's going on, Severus? A girl's voice came from the end of the hall. Venite incantatem, Snape whispered, hurriedly. The stone stopped at once, the rope vanished, and Remus's legs came unstuck all at once. He wobbled and staggered backwards, leaning against the wall. He looked up in time to see Lily, his saviour, hurrying towards them. She stopped when she saw Remus, who was quickly trying to wipe the blood from his face. She looked at Snape and frowned. What you doing, Sev? Nothing. He looked at the ground, scuffing the toe of his shoe on the flagstones. Just chatting to Lupin, weren't we, Mulciber? Mulciber shrugged, unconvincingly. Lily looked at Remus. He looked away, embarrassed. Bad's enough to be caught by Severus. He didn't need her feeling sorry for him, too. He snatched his wand from Severus quickly and turned, starting to walk away as fast as he could. Wait! Remus! Lily ran after him. He didn't stop for her, but she was quick on her feet and caught up with him. She was clutching his battle magic book in one arm and grabbed a hold of him in the other. Please! She huffed. He stopped, sighing heavily. He wanted his book back. What? He scowled. What were they doing to you? Seb wouldn't tell me, and I know it was bad. It's fine, Remus shrugged, taking his book. You're bleeding. Leave off, Evans. Remus pushed her away, trying to leave again. She kept hurrying alongside him. I've told him to stop picking on you. I don't know why he does it. I mean, you don't even go around with Potter and Black anymore. I told him that. Why would that matter? They're the ones he really wants to annoy. If he knows that you've got sick of them too, then... Wait. Remus stopped, still. Lily nearly collided into him. Are you saying that you'd be okay with it if Mulciber and Snape was cursing James and Sirius instead of me? Well, Lily flushed. I mean, it would be a fair fight at least. And, you know, they do bring it on themselves, acting the way they do. Remus felt even more uncomfortable now. She thought that James and Sirius had attacked Severus both times. She had no idea it was him at all. This confirmed one of his worst fears. Lily thought that Remus only hung around with James and Sirius because he was odd, and because they let him. Did everyone in the castle think that he was as pathetic as Peter? You're wrong, Remus frowned. Now leave me alone, will ya?